I want to start with Mr. Reed Cowan's testimony because I've not been a member of this committee for the entire duration. And by the way, I'm very sorry for the threats to your family in the course of all this. No one should endure that. But when I did sit through Reed Cowan's testimony, and just so I'm clear, he obviously was a significant donor. But is it right also? I just want to get this right. He was a former member of the We Charity Advisory Board. Is that right?
Yes, we had an honorary advisory board about 15 years ago, and in an honorary capacity, we had him and others participate.
And what he told this committee, was it true?
As we shared in our opening remarks, Mr. Cowan, first of all, we're heartbroken about what happened 15 years ago. A plaque was changed. Very unfortunately, one of two plaques for a school that was built in Kenya. 4 schools in total were built. 2 had plaques and 1 was unfortunately changed. And we are looking into it. We actually created a board committee to find out what happened. We're taking this very seriously. We really would like to understand and to make sure that he has all the information on this topic. We were able to and apologize, but we've of course got much more to do.
What do you now make of the December article in Bloomberg where staff joked that We plaques should be made of Velcro because they were swapped so frequently? I know it was initially the response was that that's never happened. What do you make of staff saying that now?
We understand that 2 cases have been identified in that same village at the same time about 15 years ago, and we want to research it. We want to get to the bottom of it. It shouldn't have happened. We apologize for those 2 cases, and we're going to continue to look in case there's anyone else that this has happened to. And as context to give one thing that's sometimes, and I'm not saying this happened in this particular case because again it's 15 years ago. We're trying to figure out our records.
Well, rather than speculate as to how would this have happened, in the sense that who is responsible for moving these plaques?
It would have been in Kenya. It would have been a member of the Kenya team, theoretically. The thought that comes potentially to mind, and again, I'm not going to speculate about Mr. Cowan, but generally, is we have funding to build schools, but funding also comes in to provide teacher training, lunches for kids, vaccinations. The funding to actually run a school is exponentially more than the cost to build the school, as you can imagine. So sometimes multiple plaques are placed on a project because it takes multiple donors to run the project.
But why would a plaque ever be taken down, I guess, is the part I've tried to think it through, but I just can't really figure out the answer to that one.
I agree with you. It should never have happened. We made a mistake. So there is a mistake that was made in the organization involving that man's plaque. And one of those 2 plaques should not have been taken down. You're absolutely right. And that's why I called him and I apologized. We publicly apologized. And we know that that's something that we need to get to the bottom of.
But what is a member? So look, as I say, I haven't gone down the rabbit hole like some of my colleagues on this. I was a bit skeptical about the contract to begin with because I thought Canada Summer Jobs was the better place for it. But I didn't really go down the rabbit hole of who was ultimately to blame in all of this. But it does concern me when I look at, and I take your point, this can be a partisan place, but your staff aren't partisan. And so to have staff joke that We plaques should be made of Velcro, and then in the Fifth Estate, they spoke to more than a dozen former employees who had concerns that the organization was not always transparent with donors. What's a member of the public like me to make of this? Not partisan actors like Mr. Angus, who I happen to like, but staff and dozens of staff.
I had thousands and thousands of staff over time, and we're pleased that many of them loved their experience with the organization. And specifically on the Fifth Estate, they had one example of an individual that they said was confused on whether they had funded the entirety of a water project. And actually, it's subsequently being clarified that that individual was not confused. But unfortunately, that piece went in the public domain and has been repeated and repeated and repeated. And that creates real difficulty for us as an organization. In fact, that later, CBC put a piece on the air involving boreholes. And the donors that were featured on that, 8 of the donors signed an open letter say they were misrepresented. In fact, they were very clear and knew that they were funding the maintenance and the drilling of the borehole. And so I'm happy to have this conversation with you. I know it's obviously out of the scope, and I appreciate that people have stayed within the scope of pandemic spending. But we as an organization, the money goes to help kids. We are transparent with our donors. We're not perfect. We make errors. We absolutely make errors, like Mr. Cowan's plaque. And we try to own those errors to the best of our ability and fix them when we can.
What's the name of the individual who would be?
That's time. Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
This is March 15th. This is the anniversary of Wesley Cowan's death. And I think we were all pretty moved when we heard Reed Cowan, because you realize you don't get over a loss like that. That's why memorials are so important. That's why they have to be treated with such sacred trust. And this is then also the anniversary of when you dedicated that school to his son. And that trust was broken. So I want to ask, how soon after Reed Cowan left was that plaque taken down?
Mr. Angus, this is the one thing that we do agree with you on, and fully. It should never have happened.
So how soon after?
15 years ago, people are looking at the records. I don't know the answer to that question. We've put another standing committee to find the answer, and we should have that answer. And he is owed that answer. We are looking into that.
He is owed that answer, because the issue is you didn't take the plaque down once. You took it down twice, because he went back in 2008 and wanted to see the building. We have the TV footage. And your staff did everything they could to keep him from getting to that building. And finally, he insisted because it was his son's school. And he went back, and it was a different plaque. You'd thrown the first plaque out, and you put a second plaque up. So then you took that plaque down and put somebody else's plaque up. So to follow up on Mr. Erskine-Smith's comments about staff, your staff joking about this, we have articles in Bloomberg about this. We've had Fifth Estate. The fact that you took that plaque down twice shows this wasn't an accident. This was willful. You sold and you got Mr. Cowan to take his son's death and legacy and build a story across America. And then when he was gone, you gave that school to someone else. How do you justify that?
So firstly, what you described was not accurate, but here's where I agree with you.
That was accurate. He has footage of it. We've seen the pictures of the plaque. I know you've got 100 and some things about all the wrong stuff I've said. It's actually I love it. I'm reposting your gaslighting, but I have the photos of the plaques. You had to go out and buy a cheap knockoff plaque because you threw the first one out. That's 2 plaques. These are the allegations that are against you.
And those are
to answer that.
And that's why we are looking into them. I am with you on this. I'm not fighting you on this, or I agree with you. This is serious. This is why, even though it's years ago.
I've spoke to many of your former staff who say that you guys put on a show for donors. It was about selling them on that emotional tag, that they talked these jokes about donor Velcro plaques. You know, it was Mr. Cowan who's asked for a police investigation. I just forwarded his concerns to the RCMP. It was Mr. Cowan who believes that he was defrauded. He is an member of your advisory board, for crying out loud. He was a big fundraiser. For you to say this was one-off, we've seen the articles in Bloomberg, as my colleague said. You keep saying they're mistakes. You keep saying things are wrong in the Fifth Estate. Is like everybody. I know Charlie Angus is being mean to you, but is everyone else as well?
Mr. Angus, you're out of time, but we will allow for
point
of order.
Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Polyev.
Yes, Mr. Chair, this point of order is to give notice to the committee that at the end of the proceedings, Conservatives will be putting forward a motion to recall the Kielburger brothers unless they provide the total amount that they and their affiliated organizations have paid the Trudeau family before the end of these hearings. They have not yet done so. So there will be a motion to that effect. That is notice to the Kielburger brothers and their lawyer that they should get their calculator sharpened so that they can get that answer before the end of these proceedings, or they will be back again to testify. Thank you.
We'll allow for a short answer to Mr. Angus's question.
Thank you.
And then we'll turn to Mr. Barrett.
Thank you.
Allow me to say I appreciate the point of order. We will get you the information. And actually, I appreciate you've stayed on the, ironically, I'm with you, Mr. Polyev. Rarely do I say this. You've stayed on the mission of looking at CCSG. And so I understand that I appreciate your focus on protecting Canadian taxpayers. And I understand.
I bet you don't want to answer about what you're doing with your Kenyan donors. I understand that too. Thank you.
Let's focus. Let's answer Mr. Angus's question if that's possible, and then we'll turn to Mr. Barrett. Mr. Kielburger will turn to you for a short answer with regards to Mr. Angus's question.
Mr. Cowan gave to Help Children in Kenya. Exactly what he did. That school continues to operate. All those schools, thousands of children have graduated. We are deeply grateful to him. We're looking through our records from 15 years ago to find out what happened. You are absolutely right, sir. Mr. Cowan's absolutely right. It never should have happened. We are upset, frankly, more than you, Mr. Angus. We're upset on this because it should not have happened.
I'm just wondering, because I know you said you wanted to get to and read Cowan's concerns, and I appreciate that. How were you able to confirm that the plaques had in fact been removed? Who on the ground confirmed that to you?
Sorry, would you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so you've confirmed that Reed Cowan's the plaque was removed. You said you confirmed that it happened in one other instance.
Yeah.
How did you confirm that? Who on the ground? I don't need a name. Just what position of that individual confirmed that to you?
One of the locals bike and drove out to the school and took a look to make sure that and found the plaque wasn't there, and that was a serious issue. Yes.
And you were aware that the plaque for Reed Cowan was associated with that particular school?
Correct. We apologize for this. And in full transparency, that same village, we have found out around that same time, there was a second plaque that we know of, and that's why we're doing a full investigation of that, of across the organization, but particularly that time frame, to try to understand what went wrong. We phased out plaques about 12 years ago because the local community doesn't want plaques in the schools because it's their schools. They pay, they maintain, they continue after we hand it over to them. So we stopped doing plaques, again, about a dozen years ago. But we recognize that this is an issue, and this is a very important issue, and this is why we're trying to get into this.
Yeah, I suppose it's not just about the plaque per se. I mean, it's about the plaque and certain representations made to donors, but equally, I would say the concern stems from representations made to donors that their funding is going to a project and that you're not soliciting the same funding for that same or different funding for that same project. I recognize what you say about Bohr.
Yeah.
Require. I recognize that there may be additional expenses that require additional funding.
May I respond to that? Is that possible? Just because I really
yeah. But before you do it, I guess I'm seeking clarity. I know, and I appreciate you are concerned with this. I'm seeking clarity for how you are going to get to the bottom of this. That who is it you have tasked with getting to the bottom of this, and who is it on the ground that is going to get to the bottom of this for you?
I appreciate the question. So just two quick things. Number one, I feel like some people maybe are misunderstanding that yes, we have funders who fund. But that's not just our model. We also program in schools for 5, 7, sometimes 10 years. So again, school lunches, teacher training, school supplies, programs for kids, all of that requires incremental funding. That's why people pool their funding into a village project. They pool it to support all these initiatives so that it can support the kids. It's not just building a building. An empty building does no good. You need all the other programs. And to answer your question, we have a standing committee of the board that has now been formed. Publicly, it is Jerry Connolly, who's the former director of education of the Toronto District School Board, who is going to lead this standing committee and who's looking at this issue, both from Canada, and we also have a team in Kenya that is digging into this. It will take a while. This is, a lot of paper records from 15 years ago in Kenya, but we're trying to figure out the answer to this question. But we are committed to finding out the answer to this question because it is important. And we are, I hear you. And we heard Mr. Cowan. And again, we are not perfect. But in 25 years, thousands of projects, 45 countries, with clean water and health, we make mistakes, and we apologize for those mistakes.